had gotten generous support from a Mellon New Directions grant, and in some ways began, in terms of thinking about GIS, as a tool that I, as a historian and ethnographer, can use. Began with a person in the GIS lab at Carleton College who did a workshop back in 2013 on GIS. And I went to it and was overwhelmed by the prospect and by the enormity of the task of, as a historian not trained in geography or cartography, to try to figure out how to make use of the kind of complicated set of tools and methodologies available, and yet through the patience, work, and support of various individuals and groups of students over the last 5 years, I've been able to put together something that I hope you'll find stimulating and worth your time today. The outline of this presentation is as follows. I'll make some brief comments about the legacies, about ways in which I see the legacies of race and slavery in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. I'll talk a bit about, but not too much, because already we've had a pretty robust conversation about the British manumission records. But I'll mention them briefly and then talk about ways in which I'm using GIS to map these journeys, right? Which is the contribution that I'm seeking to offer. I'll reference some of the maps that I've created, invite your thinking about ways I could further develop them. The maps themselves are preliminary, right? They're maps that I've been creating over the last 5 months that are efforts to try to, first of all, find the XY coordinates of all these places referenced inconsistently within these manuscripts, and then to figure out how to best, or what are the different ways and benefits of mapping different dimensions or layers, as we would say in GIS, layers of the data, ways of mapping layers of the data in a manner that would be helpful. Right, in a manner that would be illuminating, and then I'll end with some questions to invite you to engage me around. So just a few brief comments around this. More than normal, I've put a lot of text on my slides here, in part just acknowledging, the conversation while it's about Indian Ocean and Atlantic connections, right? People are trained in different ways, in different languages, coming from different places. And for me, I'm also trying to concretize in 20 minutes a whole range of different kind of conversations and audiences that I'm seeking to engage. And so just want to make sure a few things were really highlighted. One is understanding that slavery was part of a long history of racialization that we need to think about in the context of the development of racial capitalism. And to me, I see that as a really crucial to thinking globally, right? And to making connections even where the logics of race, the particular taxonomies of how race operates in one context or another may vary. Which bodies are being exploited may vary, but the development of kind of global capitalist system that folks like Paul Gilroy have framed as part of a racial capitalism, I think are crucial. Within that, the extraction and exploitation of human, material, and natural resources is really key, right? And that has been part of or drawn into and overlapping with the history of the construction of nation states in ways that make quite legible and justify the exploitation of particular bodies along a kind of racial logic, right? And there's a lot of scholarship that's engaged this that I don't think would be the most productive use of my time to cite here at this moment, but to acknowledge that there are different, again, as we think about within the Indian Ocean region and comparatively, to be really conscientious about that there are a whole range of taxonomies for ethnicity, gender, sexuality, color, and religion that are at stake, that are implicated within the development and transformations in a global capitalist framework as well. To think about racialized slavery under settler colonialism in the Americas, but maybe to, you know, I'm really curious to hear how people think about, while you don't have the same, to think about how helpful is it to think about a particular formation of settler colonialism in a place like the Gulf and in different parts of the Indian Ocean area region as well, right? You know, again, I recognize the limits of that. It's not the same like you have in the context of the U.S., but to think about how, in what ways are particular bodies moving, claiming territory, extracting resources, constructing hierarchies of value of bodies, using race, ethnicity, religion within this process, right? And you know, and I think something that that I don't hear enough of when we talk about the hegemony of the Atlantic model, and I think that hegemony is clear, right? I don't think that needs to be contested, but I think much more signposting of the conditions under which that's part of a Western imperial project. That imperial project has been about also the monopolization of a particular discourse of freedom, and deployed that as a lens through which to think about the value and positionality of different nation states globally, right? That there's a particular way, and again, some of this conversation, you know, we started having toward the end around the whole notion of freedom. And what factors have fueled or silenced conversations around slavery and racialization in different contexts, right? So it's, again, I'm trying to invite considering the nuances and not simply along a kind of polarization of either, you know, America's, Western Europe, the West hegemony. And part of that hegemony is also the ways in which people challenge it through engaging a kind of silence in conversations around slavery, right? That it's also part of that kind of dynamic as well, right? Okay. Paying attention to my time here. I'm going to be really conscious. I have 10 minutes. I'm going to be really conscious about trying to stick to time. Okay. And so it's within this context, right, that my own, in terms of thinking about the legacies of race and slavery, that I first got interested in heritage in the Gulf. And it just started looking at images of and I'll fast, no, I won't. With an image in the Dubai Museum of a very prominent image of a pearl diver. The museums now is getting, the whole exhibits there are being redone. But there's this large image of a pearl diver, you know, situated in a kind of underwater environment. And in 2012, I was, you know, moving between the Dubai Museum and a number of museums in Dubai, Sharjah, Al Ain, and Abu Dhabi, and just started asking questions about why the hyper-representation of darker skins, more easily or typically African-identified features with people impearling and fishing than merchants. Right, that was the kind of what I began to initially notice. And that led me to then begin to ask questions about, okay, there seems to be something like a racialization happening here through heritage, through the ways in which how bodies are represented, right, to construct the nation, and in particular around a kind of Bedouin, Arab, Sunni national identity or default identity within many of the Arab Gulf states, right? So that's something that really has drawn me. Anyhow, again, I'm just referencing here that these have been some of the early thinking that I've had. And let me make a brief reference here. So within that was the context in which I began to engage the scholarship of various ones in this room in terms of thinking about the history of slavery in the Gulf, again, the kind of comparison to the Atlantic and the differentiation and the rethinking of what are our default assumptions about one slave system versus another, right? Benign versus benevolent. Well, that actually, you know, when you get into the pearling economy, is Matt Hopper's work, among others, has shown, right, that doesn't really hold together, et cetera. But how it connects back to the heritage is heritage sites assuming that it's nature that is the cause of misfortune associated with the dangers of being involved in the pearling industry, and the manumission records make clear, right, that it's exploitation of people's labor, right, it's abuse, right, ill treatment that is the cause. And so asking questions about, again, that disjuncture between what's represented in heritage and what, you know, do we see in the archival record, and what other voices might that be pointing to as a rethinking of the kind of popular discourses and the construction of a nation. So briefly, just highlighting the concentration of applications around Bahrain, Muscat, and Sharjah. What I've been doing is spending a significant amount of time thinking about Bahrain. So this is a place that I've been traveling to since 2012, more intensely since 2016, because of its significance within the pearling industry historically, and wanting to ask questions around the legacies of slavery, racialization, how it functions with respect to the history and memory of pearling. I'll fast forward here, you know, acknowledging, again, the kind of particular taxonomies of slavery, of race in the context of British manumission records, and to think about the role that, and again, I feel like this was really a thread pulled or referenced kind of briefly in an earlier presentation, but to think about how the British are involved in trying to, are mobilizing a particular kind of racial logics around slavery and the intervention that makes, and I think this was the point that was raised earlier, and that we need to think about that in the context of a global capitalism that sees key who is extractable, what materials are extractable, what labor is extractable and exploitable, right? And that the identification of different, the rendering of people along this kind of ethnic, cultural, geographic, you know, way is about that logic of trying to make visible how these individuals are going to be incorporated into an industrial global capitalist system, right? And Ahmed Sakinga's, you know, work in the context of the continuities around slavery in Qatar with the ways that slave labor was used early in the oil economy, I think really makes that point very powerfully. Okay. So highlighting some of the limitations here of the data before I turn to the mapping is the data is inconsistent in terms of what gets documented in the manumission records, right? It's unwieldy, it's incomplete, there's overlap in terms of testimony, there's issue of translation, there's the commentary of the agent, sometimes in handwriting, sometimes on subsequent documents that are part of the whole file of materials. Of course, there are what records survived. Okay, okay, so you see, thank you. And so within that context, then, thinking about what role GIS can play as a whole system of knowledge around how we analyze patterns in spatial data, right, is really the kind of question that I'm asking, right? I've put a lot of text on here to, you know, again, so you have some definitions to draw upon, and you can begin to think about to make the methodology visible and to think about what aspects, you might want to question, interrogate, etc. The first law of GIS is everything is related to everything, but nearer things are more related than distant things, right? So let me just turn briefly, there's a whole study of critical GIS, right, which tries to think through, how it raises problems about assuming access is equal, that this technology hasn't been used as a tool of exploitation itself, right? So that's there. So what you see here is, so part of what I've done, taking these manumission records, is looked at, again, what is the different locational data referenced? You see people referencing the locations of places where they were either born, sold, transited through, worked, etc. But again, that data is inconsistent in terms of the categories. Sometimes it's a town, sometimes it's a region, sometimes it's what we would associate with a kind of modern nation state category in formation in the 1920s to 40s. So one, I've had to disaggregate all the data and try to put it within these categories just so I kind of know what I'm working with as well. And then, of course, making decisions about, where do I plot the XY coordinate or the longitude latitude coordinate, which again, we can problematize, etc. Where I think I feel good about the decisions involved in doing that is I'm not measuring distance, right? So I don't do kind of distance buffer analysis, people within a certain radius of distance, their relationship. I stay away from that, again, because I think the data isn't useful for that. It's too inconsistent. But I think there are other ways that it can be used. So let me just turn briefly. So I'm going to show several sets of maps. Here's a distributed flow map, right? You can see the kind of flow of individuals that it represents out of East Africa, others already born into enslavement or enslaved in the Gulf, to Bahrain, Oman, or Sharjah, right? And you can see, the different colorations. Sharjah is in green, Bahrain is in red, Muscat is in blue. I would say take this as a working data set. I wouldn't say take this as if all the data is fully complete, etc. But it can help us point to some of the patterns, right? And the real questions, issues that I'm interested in are, what are the patterns that mapping helps us to elucidate, to more clearly interrogate, or to think about how we are representing in our minds and in our work these histories, right? Here's a spider diagram that focuses on 2 points. Where's the first point reference of capture or enslavement, and then the point where they apply for manumission, and here that site is Bahrain, right? But again, just thinking about ways of trying to represent movement. Again, I think an important limitation of this is don't take the line as the exact trajectory of movement. It's simply shortest distance between 2 points that the map is representing. It's not representing the actual path of journey, right? But I have tried to, in these next few maps, try to get a bit more at that. And again, I'm still young in the use of this technology. But here you're going to see a series of maps that take a set of cases from Zanzibar and seek to map first, second, third, fourth locations along the journey. So that's the first leg. Here's the second leg. I know it's messy, but just to get the overall kind of concept and thinking. Here's the third leg, right? And here is the fourth leg. And here's what all that looks like on a map where you color code each individual leg. Again, messy. You'll see this in other formats moving forward. So let me just raise a few, last questions. That is my time. So can I get like 1 minute, right? Okay. This is good. This is good. This is moving us along. So one, how best to represent via maps the networks of transport or movement of people, right? With respect to sale, work. Thinking about how best to represent women's and children's mobility and exploitation within this system, right? I think is a way it can be used. How racialized family and community formation can be documented under slavery and manumission. How maps might help emphasize the labor work skills, i.e. domestic labor, water transport, date, or pearl extraction, right? Which are, again, different ways of kind of categorizing the actual work that individuals at least identify themselves as doing. Recognizing that sometimes an individual did multiple types of work over the course of their experience as an enslaved person, and narrated that within the manumission records. Gosh, there's so much more to say. But I think you're getting the larger idea, and many of you have worked so much with this material. I'd imagine a whole number of things are bubbling up for you, even if it's, hey, I don't know why you made a decision to map it in that way. Then that would be fine and helpful. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to engaging.
Thank you, Thabiti. So we're moving to the second speaker, who is Preben Karshom. He's a professor emeritus at the Global International Development Studies, Roskilde University in Denmark.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the Sharjah Africa Institute for organizing this. I think this is a great occasion, and I'm very proud and happy to be here. So I'll speak about search of origins and legacies of race and slavery in the Western Indian Ocean, and methodological challenges in studying this. So a search for roots is central to aspirations of descendants of slaves for recognition and rights in both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. So this is a well-chosen and topical theme for comparing those two contexts. In the Western Indian Ocean, such efforts were made difficult by the complicated nature of displacements, the many stages of mobility and transformations of self-understanding that took place in response to stigmatization and racism. So my own ongoing research is on the Danish slave trade in the Indian Ocean, from India and Batavia and through Mauritius to the Cape. But since we are in Zanzibar and since islanders are the focus for the symposium, my presentation will revisit and discuss the Durban Zanzibaris, the liberated Africans who were taken to South Africa in the 1870s. So this will provide me with an opportunity also to pay tribute to Professor Sharif and to the Zanzibar Indian Ocean Research Institute for research and organizational achievements, which the work of the Africa Institute in Monsoon now so honorably help to carry forward. So my point of departure will be a close reading of an 1877 return of liberated Africans from British Natal, which gives the details of 502 so-called Zanzibaris who arrived in Durban in 5 batches between 1873 and 1877. And this story was highlighted in an exemplary article contributed by Professor Sharif to a volume published by the UNESCO Slave Route Project on the African diaspora in Asia, Explorations of a Less Known Fact, that was published in 2009. And Professor Sharif used a wide range of sources, in particular consular records from the National Archives of Zanzibar to write his article. And on the basis of research I was then able to do on records kept in the KwaZulu-Natal archives in Pietermaritzburg, I was able to add a few more dimensions to Professor Sharif's analysis in an article I published in the Journal of Southern African Studies in 2016, which drew on the information contained in this return of liberated Africans. So this particular return has not been discussed and analyzed in detail before, and I think a close reading may help us also with the general discussion of what kinds of insights can be drawn from registers of slaves, liberated Africans, and indentured laborers. Because such registers exist in their tens of thousands and provide an important part of the basis for the many database construction projects that are currently underway and of which we will get to discuss some tomorrow in the last panel when Jane Hooper and Matthew Hopper and Vijaya Tilak will make presentations. So as is clear from this return, the Zanzibaris did not originate in Zanzibar, but predominantly in northern Mozambique as Makua-speaking mainlanders, though some members of the group had origins further north on the East African mainland across from Pemba and Zanzibar. Their diaspora identity as Zanzibaris and came to believe and invest actively and creatively until they, or some of them more recently, came to reconsider and re-find their roots as Amakua rather than Zanzibaris. So these transformations from mainlanders to islanders and back again may show us something also about the openings and closures involved in different strategies of diaspora and identity construction from the 1870s to the present. So all these registers and returns have particular contexts and backgrounds. And the background to this 1877 return was the neglect, the criticism of neglect that was directed at the protector of Indian immigrants in Pietermaritzburg for not living up to the conditions that had been imposed. Import these liberated Africans through the approval of the British consul in Zanzibar. And they include a number of conditions: that they must be protected against cruel punishments, they must be instructed in the English language and the great truths of Christianity, and so on. So the first batch of these arrivals arrived on a Royal Navy ship called the Britain on 4th August 1873. This year is the 150th anniversary of this arrival, which will be celebrated in Durban by the descendants of this group of Zanzibaris. But what I want to talk about is what does this return really tell us and what does it not tell us. So it has information of names, sex, dates of arrival, names of ships from which disembarked, age and date of assignment as indentured labor or apprentice, name of employer to whom assigned, wages in shillings, and so on, how employed, births, deaths, desertions, remarks like transfers of contract to another employer or escape from contract. So I'll not go, I don't have time to go into detail with all these records. As to sex, it is clear that there were 313 male, 189 female members of the five batches, 354 adults and 148 children, that 52 of them were 6 years or less, 153 were 12 years or less, and 175 16 years or less. So children were very prominent among the group, and to whom assigned the most prominent employers were well-known Durban and Natal farmers, big companies and big business families. 56 went to the Durban Public Works Department, and the children were very much in demand as domestic servants. And the return shows that one was assigned to MacLeod, who was a protector of Indian immigrants, but we know from other sources that he had more than one child assigned to him. As to wages, what is interesting about the rates of wages is that they were higher than those paid to Indian indentured laborers during the same period. So in some respects, these liberated Africans were given preferential status also to Indian indentured laborers. But there are two entries that we can look at a bit more closely. I mean, the date of ships' arrival and ships' names, which Professor Sharif has already analyzed. So there's one Navy ship involved with the first batch in 1873, bringing in freed slaves or people who were going to be enslaved from Madagascar. A second arrival in 1874, also bringing in liberated Africans freed at Madagascar. 1876, and this was by not by a navy ship, but by a steamer that had actually come through. The Royal Navy had brought the liberated Africans to Zanzibar, and they were then taken by the steamers to Durban. And the same was the case in 1876, with slaves freed in the Mozambique Channel. And then in 1876 and 77, we get a different group of slaves who had not apparently been taken in northern Mozambique, but had been freed off Pemba and had been en route from the mainland to Pemba. So this shows a bit about the mixed origins, and I'll discuss the origins further of the group. And I think concerning the latter two batches, I mean, that's where there was some uncertainties in Professor Sharif's analysis that I was able to clear up subsequently. As the names are, I think, perhaps particularly interesting, also because there's been a lot of interest among database creators of setting up databases of names, and also of beliefs in our being able to reconstruct roots and origins on the basis of names. I think this return makes this a dubious assumption in many ways. So some of the names, some of the 502 names in the return are clearly African names of some sort. Bahato, Umamapu, Kasambu, Manasama, Mamapala, Susureka. But I don't think one can say, but I mean, this is open to discussion, whether these names are of a particular Makua, Yao, and Gindu or other background. And we could not deduce very much about origins from those names. Other names are clearly Islamic, like Fatima, Hassan, Faruz, Baraka, Juma, Husane, Silimane, Ibrahim, Halima, and so on. And this is, of course, interesting because it indicates a Muslim background. But what kind of Muslim background? We don't know. I mean, what were these people who were already Muslims when taken as slaves from northern Mozambique or the eastern coast, or were they claiming to be Muslims at arrival and given their information? So that again allows for a lot of discussion and interpretation. Other names are apparently Portuguese: Catarina, Maria, Antonio, Marisa, Rusane, and so on. But again, this could indicate a lot of different things. It could indicate earlier enslavement. It could indicate contact with missionaries or with the Portuguese at Ilha, or and we don't know whether these people, how many of these people were Portuguese speakers on arrival. We know some of them were. So there are a lot of things we don't know, but I mean, it must be assumed that the most of these liberated Africans arriving in Durban were Makua speakers, and the protector of Indian immigrants had a Makua interpreter employed to be able to communicate with them. The return has no fields included for ethnicity or language or scarification and stuff like that, so it doesn't tell us anything about culture like that. I think so, but this raises important questions about what we understand by origin and roots. And I think should we see roots as looking for a particular place, or rather looking for roots in a particular history of being brought together? So it raises important questions of how we understand and define diaspora, and I think it's important for us to rethink this and to acknowledge the difficulties that exist of identifying the background roots of these enslaved people. So in Mozambique, Makua and Makoani, I mean, this is the territory explored by Abdul Sharif and Nancy Hafkin and Ned Alpers in their pioneering research of the 1960s and 70s. And it's also the area that is quite well known from the British consular reports by Lyons MacLeod, Frederick Elton, and Henry O'Neill. But it's clear from these investigations also that that Makua is an umbrella culture which brings together within it an enormous amount of subgroupings. It's a huge, poor and neglected region, also comparatively unresearched historically, anthropologically and linguistically, which now today is coming into focus because of Cabo Delgado violence, but where there's comparatively little fieldwork and close to the ground research available. There's some work available in Portuguese by Mozambican and Portuguese scholars like Medeiros in Capela and Benigna Simba, Elias Atbunate and Chapane Mutiva. But so Makua Lomwe is the largest, as to language, the largest language group in Mozambique, the largest African language spoken by about 40% of the population, but including a lot of parallel languages or language variants, including Makua Lomwe Koti from Angosh, Nahara from Ilya and Nampula city, and neighboring and overlapping with Malawi and Tanzania, and with Makonde speaking, Yao speaking, and Gindu speaking areas, and with boundaries difficult to establish very clearly between these languages and ethnic groups. It's also a region which was very conflictual during the late 19th century, where a lot of local enslavement was taking place, and where alliances and group conflicts patterns were shifting over time, where the Portuguese state, colonial state authority was absent or fragile until the early 20th century, and where power was delegated to local planters, landowners, chiefs, and sheiks, and where sheikdoms like Sankul and Angosh were centers also for anti-Portuguese warfare. So there was a trade in slaves also to finance the anti-Portuguese struggle, and like the former Mozambican Minister of Justice, José Obudo from Angosh, said at one point, the moral justification for the slave trade was, what would the moral argument be against selling useless and undisciplined youngsters for guns to fight against the Portuguese? You know, and these patterns of power constellation changing patterns also complicate the study of names. So Medeiros observes that some slave registers use caravan leaders and slavers' names for slaves rather than the names of slaves themselves. So some Makua slaves are designated Yao in some of the records, and in other cases, records from Angosh would have Koti speakers designating Makuas as slaves and Koti as non-slaves, and similarly for Nahara and Makua in Ilya. So we have these problems of locating and defining diaspora at the point of departure, and similarly huge problems of defining them at the point of arrival, where a number of contextual features influence how they are identified. So the different contexts and bureaucracies for registration, where you have very different kinds of registers for Natal compared to Mauritius and Seychelles, for instance, where in Mauritius and Seychelles you have sort of the pioneering use of photographs to register arriving liberated Africans, because of the very strict legal regimes that were established there against vagrancy and imposed on indentured labor that were coming through their periods of contract. So we have systems where classifications partly reflect the rationalistic pretensions established through intercontinental communications and transnational bureaucracies of systems of protectors of immigration, but also a lot of very arbitrary things, a lot of errors, incompetence, carelessness, and so on, displayed in the records that result in simplification and stereotyping. And then we have different frameworks for reception and the philanthropic embrace by Islam and Catholic missions in the case of the liberated Africans coming to Durban, with the Zanzibaris that were coming into the contact with Indian Muslims in Durban, being encouraged by their contact with these Indian Muslims to develop their own self-understanding and community autonomy, while fellow liberated Africans who came under the embrace of the French Catholics sort of disappear from sight, because they are taught Zulu language and they are encouraged to become part of a generalized African population. So all these things of different contexts, specific contexts surrounding diaspora creation at the point of departure and the point of arrival have to be taken into account. So I have, in my own research, I have worked quite extensively with at an Amakua research committee set up by the descendants of these liberated Africans in Durban, which has worked very hard to get behind the invented identity of Zanzibaris to a more authentic identity of origin as Amakuan. So this has involved some different kinds of efforts, like physically visiting ships for disembarkment of slaves, and residential areas for Makua-speaking family members of some of these descendants of slaves in Durban, and wandering through the areas of these pestilential creeks that Elton wrote about in his consular records. A second strand of endeavor has been to identify trajectories of origin through Muslim brotherhood networks of the Shadilia and the Kadiria in Nampula, Mosuril, Ilya, northern Mozambique, in Maputo, and through some of the elders of the community. This is a photo from 2011 when we had an Indian Ocean conference here, organized by U.A.E. and a network of Indian Ocean researchers, where we brought some of these Zanzibaris here to discuss with them, and where they visited also a number of lieux de mémoire, and this was Malim Idriss's collection of Kadiriya Sufi materials in Zanzibar city, which they visited. Anyway, but so my general point is that this search for origins and displacing an invented identity with an authentic one has had some side effects, if you like, of essentialization and exclusion. So what was remarkable about this community of liberated Africans establishing itself in Durban was its inclusiveness. So it included both people who had been part of this African contingent of liberated Africans, but then included other poor Muslims of both Indian and other backgrounds into its residential area and community structures, and was also very open to other Muslims arriving from Malawi and other places in southern Africa. And this sort of openness and inclusiveness has, I think, suffered by the search for roots and authenticity. So in these celebrations planned now for the 4th and 5th of August this year, the invited speakers will be Makua representatives of Makua-speaking communities in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, and so on. And it will be there will be a day of religious commemoration dedicated to Sufi ritual. But the whole history of interaction with Indians and the whole history of incorporating Malawians or non-Makua speakers into the Zanzibari fold will not be commemorated. So the imaginary islanders or the mainlanders who became imaginary islanders and open-minded oceanic thinking people have in some ways become mainlanders again and thinking about identity in a much more restrictive way than they used to. Thank you very much, and apologies for taking.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Mustafa Milnawi, who is an associate professor of history and director of Critical Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Studies Initiative at Cornell University.
I'm just going to move this from here because I need to read from my computer. Okay. Do you mind?
And you will change this slides?
Yeah, I'll just change it from my in the song.
It's okay.
So this is fine as long as we can, because I don't know I'm there. So, hello everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I'm a little bit outside of the world that I usually inhabit, which is kind of like Ottoman world, and I'm very happy to be out of it and here with you today, because a lot of the questions that I deal with are actually questions that are being dealt with today and are a little new to the Ottoman history world. So I'm learning a lot. Before I begin, of course, I want to thank the conveners, the organizers, the Africa Institute for making all this happen and for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. What I will hope to do is, because I'm going to take you a little bit outside of where we've been geographically this morning, I'm going to take you north, quite a bit north actually, to Istanbul for a bit, to the metropole of another empire. We've been talking about the British Empire for a while. I'm going to take you to the Ottoman Empire, and then from there I will take you back to the Horn of Africa. And if I have time, I'll take you back home to see how the Horn of Africa impacts life in the metropole. So the 4 points that I'm going to go through today, hopefully on time, first I'm going to give you a little bit of background, kind of situated geographically, and the time and space in which some of the individuals that I follow in my research have inhabited. So basically, think of it as their social spaces, or their habitus actually is a little bit more, but to give you a sense of where they grew up, what kind of ideas they grew up with, and how that might impact their notion of race, or the racialization of themselves and others, which usually happens in tandem. I'm going to talk about the complications of racialization when we go. I know you're supposed to say something when that happens. Never mind. So the complications of racialization, when you step outside of the binary of black and white, some of us have touched on it today. I'm going to talk about racialization that does not necessarily correspond to our notions of color or what we think of as skin color. Racialization takes place. It's not as most of you know. Racialization is a process, and I will argue that racialization emerges when differentiation takes place in a meaningful way that goes for a long time, that then starts to impact your perception of self and other. In particular, in this case, I'm going to be talking about the othering in the Ottoman context, late 19th century, early 20th century. and the idea of and the term Arab and what it means. Arab has a very complicated etymology in Turkish, and at the end of the 19th century, it starts to mean a lot of things, including black. So here, Arab is black, so this is going to complicate things a little bit. So I'm going to talk about also the transition. I'm going to hopefully give you an example of following one person and their perception of how they identify themselves versus other in the African context, and how the transition goes from identifying oneself, regardless of ethnicity, as Ottoman to fit into a larger Ottoman imaginary, to them identifying themselves as white. In relation to an African other. And if I have time, I'll take you back home and see how that actually manifests itself in Istanbul. So, before I start, we're talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century. So the people that I follow in a micro, actually it's a micro history project. The people that I follow both at home and along their travels, particularly in Africa, are people that would have grown up, they would have been 18 or 19 around the loss of the Balkans, which is 1879, around 1879 is really when most of the Balkans were lost. Huge psychological shock for the empire, particularly the elite in the Ottoman Empire, regardless of whether they were elite that spoke Turkish at home or Arabic at home. For if you're elite, part of the imperial thin layer on top, the loss of the Balkans was a huge shock beyond the loss of anything else, because for many elite, the Balkans were the heart of the empire. I always try and make the point of reminding people that this will remain for a long time, and the Turkish that you learn today, if you were to go to Istanbul, modern Turkish, is actually a transliteration of Ottoman Turkish spoken with the Balkan accent, because that was the elite accent. So that's how much the Balkans were at the center of the empire. But more than that, I really want to also remind you that loss was not the only thing that they were dealing with. They were participating in a new project that I deal with in my first book, the kind of an Ottoman scramble for Africa, in which they join other European powers in trying to claim colonies. And I use that word because they changed the word from province to colony. They tried to use colonies, and in their imagination, everything that you see in Salmon was very much rightfully, in reality or aspirationally, part of the Ottoman Empire. You need to keep that in mind. Both of these things are happening in the minds of the elite that I'm going to be, the elite Istanbulu Arab Ottomans that I will be following as quickly as I can in this paper. So I use microhistorical approach to research late imperial attitudes in the Ottoman context by focusing specifically on Arab Ottoman community, an Arab Ottoman community that set up households in Istanbul specifically in the 1880s and worked for the Yildiz Palace or the Sublime Porte in various capacities. And they, most importantly, deeply identified in a very existential way with Ottoman imperial rule. As the empire suffered from external and internal pressures and an erosion of its sovereignty, they held on to the possibility of an alternative future for their children under the large tent of an imagined, diverse, and inclusive Ottoman state until their hopes were dashed with the collapse of the last Muslim rule in the region. This generation that was the last one to spend its entire lifespan under Ottoman rule, taking their last breaths in the dying days of the empire. The last generation to be born under Ottoman rule were their children and grandchildren, old enough to remember living in imperial Istanbul, but young enough to have a post-Ottoman afterlife in the new geopolitical realities of the age of the nation state. So the penultimate Ottoman generation that I focus on was the one that experienced the internal centralization efforts of the Hamidian administration. Most of you might not be familiar with it. I'm more than happy to answer questions about it. But more importantly, the major defeats of the 1870s and their participation, of course, in the Conference of Berlin in 1884-85, and working for the Conference of Berlin to manifest what the Ottomans claimed was their rightful, or I should say legal, title to territories in African interior. So in the larger project, I go into their lives in very big detail. So I highlight how some members of this Arab Ottoman community identified or disengaged purposefully with notions of Ottomanness, Europeanness, Arabness, and whiteness. I do that through examining their writing while they traveled in Africa, Europe, but also while accompanying European royalty in the Levant. I put their habitus in conversation with historical events of that period and the textual and pictorial works that were left behind by one specific, though large family, known in the Arab world as Al-Azams. In Istanbul, they were Azamzadeh. So what I'm about to say is actually quite controversial in the Ottoman world, and I'll tell you the stakes that are at when I try to complicate notions that people take for granted, such as what is Arab and what is Turk and what is Muslim. Also, what is race in the Ottoman Empire? People's backs can go off. So there is a sentiment in Ottoman history that to minimize the loaded meanings of ethno-racial markers, such as Arab or Turk, before the emergence of widespread ethno-nationalism in the region post-World War I. However, I argue that the exclusive focus on political organization and the rise of nationalism has left us blind to the rise of ethno-racial differentiation within Ottoman society well before the rise of popular nationalism and the rhetoric that came with it. So in the last decade of the 19th century, Ottoman society's self-perception was undergoing a transformation. Words such as Arab or Turk were not innocuous signifiers, but critical ethno-racial markers deployed in the Ottoman metropole with both positive and negative connotations. They were also embraced by some and avoided by others in this circle of Arab Ottoman statesmen well before World War I. Second, even though Turkification and Turkish nationalism might not have been influential state-sponsored projects before World War I, one cannot ignore the informal currents of ethno-racial differentiation that were taking place well before then. So the sense of marginalization of Arab Ottoman elite did not emerge overnight with the Young Turk Revolution or was manufactured by local politicians during the elections. It was a much longer process which spilled out into the open after 1908, which is the Young Turk Revolution, where the parliament was reinstated, particularly after the disappointment of the unfulfilled promises of this so-called revolution. So I do not shy away from noting when ethno-racial differentiation, which is often associated with the frontier regions or the colonial possessions of the Ottomans, was also reflected in the society of the Ottoman metropole. I'm going to be focusing on the gentleman in the middle with his hand up. His name is Sadiq al-Muayyad Azamzadeh. For the purpose of this talk, this is the person that I'm going to be taking you through his travel log as quickly as I can, who visited the Eastern Sahara and the Horn of Africa in 1895 and 1904, respectively. And his life, and I will try and relate it to his life back home as he's making his observations about the people that he's meeting. I basically argue that self-racialization of an Ottoman official and how it developed during this period of intensified colonial efforts by European and non-European empires alike points to a new relationship between Arab Ottomans and Turkish Ottomans in the metropole at the same time as Ottoman imperialists begin to develop a racialized identity, namely identifying themselves as Beyazlar or whites in relation to an African other or a black other or an Arab other, and in most cases they are overlapped in the imagination of an Arab elite. At the risk of oversimplifying the debates, until recently the knee-jerk reaction to any discussion of racism in Ottoman societies was met with an argument for the exceptionalism of the Ottoman case among global empires. It is fair to say that any critical discussion of race, racialization, and racism has often been sidestepped or shut down as topics that were artificially superimposed on the Ottoman case by Western academics grappling with racism in their own backyard. Race and racism, however, did play a role in the way that the Ottoman imperialists, like this dude, Sadiq Azamzadeh, perceived himself and the world around him. So let's follow him quickly along his travels and some of the ways he actually starts to describe himself. What I'm trying to highlight here is not give you details of his travel, but to show you how his identification of other and self changes over a 9-year period from Ottoman to white. So in his 1895 travelogue, during his mission deep into the Eastern Sahara, I examine his words, his choice of words, turn of phrases, and highlight subject matters which I argue express his anxieties, desires, and insecurities as an Arab Ottoman in an increasingly ethnocentric metropole. He left Istanbul to Benghazi by sea, and then by caravan from Benghazi to the Sahara, and then to the desert of the oasis of Kufra in the southeast corner of modern-day Libya. He carefully documented his journey and observations along the way, often in the matter of many European adventure travelers, adding flourish and highlighting the exoticism of the Arabic-speaking nomadic people of the Libyan desert. His reference to them as the natives, this is in quotes, or more often than not in one of other ways, either as Urban or individually as Bedawi, was exacting choice of terms which once translated into Arabic in 1908, and then later on in Dubai, of all places, in 1998, republished, did not always stand, often simply translated into Arab. Sadiq, an Arab Ottoman officer of Damascene origin, paid very close attention to not referring to those he met in 1895 as Arab. Choosing terminology that allowed for what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called a system of dispositions, Sadiq created a two-dimensional rendition of another world that was colored by his particular social experience up until that point in the metropole. He discursively constructed a seemingly distant and utterly exotic habitus, not only unfamiliar to the reader, but seemingly unrelated to his own life. This was an important strategy for travel writers in general, and I argue was of particular importance for Sadiq in 1895. It allowed him to act as an outside observer who shared a frame of reference with readers in the metropole while acting as a subject matter expert, as a traveler and a subject matter expert that seemingly made forget this familiar other with, after all, a person who was, after all, Arabic-speaking, Sunni Hanafi Muslim, subject of the Sultan, of the Caliph, as he describes himself. In other words, this form of discursive distancing created its own reality and did not describe one, obviously. Sadiq needed to express his understanding of himself, in this case, continuously, repeatedly, Ottoman, urban, worldly Istanbulu, by discursively creating an exoticized other, in this case, native, desert-dwelling Bedawi Saharan. Where is the 10-minute warning? Sorry, I was counting on the dinner. I was like, wow, I'm doing great. As Sadiq wrote and revised his travelogue first for the consumption of the Sultan and later for the consumption of the Turkish readers back in Istanbul, he was simultaneously producing and inhabiting what Homi Bhabha called the third space. This space was filled with gray ambivalence, a complicated self-conscious and self-referential space where the similarities and differences between the observer and observed were much harder to discursively produce and defend than for a European traveler. It was a much more complicated situation than what Edward Said described in Orientalism, where the notion of difference by the so-called Occident and between the so-called Occident and Orient were assumed. The production of a third space, quote, is a process of signification through which statements of culture or on culture differentiate, discriminate, and authorize the production of fields of force, reference, applicability, and capacity, end quote. With a discursive space that both Sadiq and his, as an Ottoman explorer, was producing simultaneously with the production of the other, in this case, the Bedouin. Now, the flip side during this time is him emphasizing not just an Ottoman self, but an undifferentiated Ottoman self, which is complicated if you think about Ottoman Empire as composed of a multicultural space. Now, the close analysis of Sadiq's choice of words and his avoidance of any description of Arabs begs the obvious counterfactual question. What if it was indeed an accident of writing rather than an intentional disassociation? This is where we need to examine what Arab means in 1895. So on a popular level, the word Arab, as a form of insult, is a present-day colloquial appropriation associated with derision that grew, people believe, out of post-World War I anti-Arab sentiment in Turkey. This idea came after the Arab Revolt. If you're an Arab or if you're someone who works in Turkey, you know that there's this, it's a very common trope. There is something like the Arab betrayal, the Arab treason, the traitor Arabs are racist tropes that are always deployed against the Arabs now, but people associate with the post-imperial world. However, I argue that it actually goes much earlier than that to the late imperial world. For example, if you look at the Turkish English lexicon, which was published in 1990, the word Arab is translated in English to the Arabian people or an Arab, but the number 2 is to a Negro. The third meaning, or the second meaning, which means Negro, or in day-to-day language means simply black. So you can call a cat Arab kedi, a cat black. Is a form of derision in the politically fraught landscape of imperial Istanbul that I argue that the conspicuous absence of any reference to familiarity or personal similarity is an indication of a conscious decision influenced by his own social space in Istanbul. I'm going to quickly jump to his second trip to Ethiopia. This is before taking off. This is with 2 individuals that accompanied him, one from Tripoli in Lebanon and one from Nablus. I will not be that long, I promise. He's looking for his sign. I'm good. I would like to... So here, there's another travelogue. This is a lot more of a famous travelogue where I kind of investigate the issue of blackness versus whiteness in the way he kind of described the other. So unlike his 1895 travelogue, in 1904, Sadiq often referred to himself as an Ottoman in contrast, he referred to himself often as a white, literally the word for white, the color, in contrast to locals whom he usually referred to simply either as natives or by ethnicity, which he assumed to be either Somali or Ethiopian. This is in the Horn of Africa. This shift in his self-portrayal marked a significant change from his Saharan travelogue. His intended audience remained the same, namely Turkish readers in Istanbul whom he assumed shared a set of commonly known cultural references and particular urban tastes. That meant that he did not have to explain or describe certain landmarks he named or cultural references he made, which only residents of Istanbul would have been able to identify. However, even though his audience remained the same, 9 years after the first travelogue, his dominant self-identification became white, identifying with what he called other whites from European countries, and he assumed that his readers in Istanbul also identified as white. It is important to note that it was not a neat division. This is not what I'm saying. This is not a white versus black. Sadiq, it was always in a, I'm borrowing it again from Homi Baba, doubling disassembling image of being in at least 2 spaces at once. That made his question of identity almost impossible to pin down. So as an Arab Ottoman imperialist place, which was necessarily a liminal one, he constructed it in opposition to what he saw and experienced on his journey. He used the usual tropes of othering that one would find in European travelogues, dehumanizing Somalis or Ethiopians or exoticizing all incidents to paint himself as part of another group of people, distinctly white. He was performing belonging to an international class of imperialists. This is not absorbing European categories wholesale, who mostly identified with similar identitarian signifiers, amongst others, and was featured at the was a feature of the turn of the 20th century imperial class, which I argue in the book the Ottoman elites were also a part of. Now, I wanted to take you back to his home. This is his children and his ivlatluk. But I won't have time. Do I have 5 minutes? No? Bitte? 1 minute? Okay, that means I'm going to go to my conclusion, which takes 3 minutes. Jesus, 1 minute. Okay, so this I'm more than happy to talk about in that question-answer period. Just to let you know, these are his children. The person in the middle is Evlatluk. I'm more than happy to talk about what an Evlatluk meant in the beginning of the 20th century. This is turning over into the 20th century when slavery was slave trade was illegal. I really want to keep in mind that slave trade is illegal. If a slave ended up in your household in the middle of Istanbul, it wasn't illegal. Do you understand what I'm saying? So people always hide behind the, oh, it became slave. No, there's still a lot of slave routes that were actually evading the Ottoman Empire that were very much, he'd take advantage of them, as well as people in Damascus, as well as other people that had, in this case, what they called evlatluk, which means, for Arabic speakers, don't confuse it with the word evlat, although it comes from it. It's the kind of a notion of a foster child that you adopt. But in this case, he was brought from Sudan. This child, his name is Bilal, which should be a hint to you all, but exactly. And it was very clear that if this Avlatluk was black, that means he was a replacement, which becomes a lot more popular when getting slaves becomes a lot more difficult in Istanbul. He's a slave by a different name. Now, to conclude, I promise I'll be quick. I'm not being glib here. So race as an official category did not appear to be an explicit factor in how the Ottoman imperial government organized its population, whether on a collective or individuated basis. So the absence of race from the official archival records is one reason why racism in Ottoman societies has been so understudied. With no state-sanctioned policies or empire-wide laws that explicitly discriminated against free people based on race, historians who are mostly dependent on the Ottoman state's archives for sources seldom study, I'm very guilty of this as well, seldom study race or racism as a societal phenomenon. However, just because the state archives do not point towards the state-sponsored discrimination does not mean that the Ottoman metropole was immune to a global trend towards ethno-racial discrimination. With a few exceptions, discussions of race and racism in the Ottoman Empire remain tucked away at the margins of books dealing with the royal court, the institution of slavery in the royal court, and more recently, and really I want to highlight this because we need to talk about it. When we're talking about slavery that people know about in the Ottoman court, usually it is in the court. It's a very privileged space. There's a billion other kinds of slavery that were not so nice. So we really need to talk about this. And more recently, research is focusing on the small Afro-Turkish community in Aydın, which is in southern Turkey. Perhaps more controversial is talking about the double meaning of Arab and its assumed connection to slavery in Turkish and its connection to this moment in imperial history, a moment of globalized racial logic which the Ottomans were not immune to and would come home to haunt them in Ottoman Istanbul like people like Sadiq. He produced it, but he becomes an object of it. Remember, at the end of the day, when the empire is collapsing, Arab Ottomans become Arab to the other, and he becomes the beneficiary, or if you will, the target of the same kind of logic that he applied in Africa. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So what I'm gonna do is not necessarily, a reflection of the content of different papers because they are really great, and I didn't get some of them before the presentation. But I think there are at least three words that I got from the three presentations. So the first one is the notion of incompleteness. Talking about sources, the incompleteness and consistency from Thabiti, and then the question of the absence. The absence because the word race doesn't exist in the archive. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about these categories. So that's from Mustafa. So if I have to touch, quickly or mainly ask questions, Thabiti, presented a wonderful, picture of how we can use, data to create maps. But in that process, it's also a creation of additional data. So the question here is, how can we think about that process itself? Because instead of using data to map or to show, but you're also creating additional data. So how can we, think about that? So the second point, which has to do with the question of the line, and the warning was really good that the line isn't a straight one. But I'm interested in your the set of data that you're using, the account. So what are the accounts about? Are they describing torture, suffering? And if that's the case, then I mean, linking to the conversation in the morning, it's the question of truth, right? So if they are going to seek for, liberation to the British, so then what kind of account they are using? Are they fabrication? Are they some kind of fabrications? So how can we think about the question of, truth and falsity in history? And I have two suggestions. You may take it or not. So the first one, maybe truth here could be thought of as an affect, right? And then the second one, using or drawing from Edouard Glissant, the notion of opacity, as a strategy for liberation or freedom and so forth. So these are the two suggestions. So probably moving to Preben, which is also very interesting, the presentation. So the idea that so the data that is there can be used for instrumentalized for political purposes. So that could be, in your case, the notion of reparation, which is at least a warning. You are warning us that if we used this data for those purposes, maybe we might not get to what we're looking for. Because what you said is that so that community in Durban was living peacefully, so there was some kind of inclusiveness. But the moment they brought this idea of the projects of 1877, right? So then there's at least some kind of disturbances, So they search for root, or let's say the question of origin becomes a futile exercise. But the question is, because the notion of reparation is important, right? So how do we think about that notion when the data that we have is incomplete, and even when we try to to complete that data from oral history or linguistic, we still not get to that point. So how can we think about the question of reparation, which is so important to these communities? And Mustafa, so I just want to know, I know the Ottoman Empire, doesn't exist anymore, but what are the things that were left from that empire that are still continuing today? So thinking about the legacies, what is it that is still playing, today in the present? So I think these are the thoughts that I wanted to throw out, and I'm going to open, to the floor so that we can, get, the questions. Yes. So here.
Thank you for 3 wonderful papers. And the word that really came to mind for me was around mobility and how we think about the construction of identity. Mobility has been seen as a tremendous value in the Indian Ocean, right? A net positive in general. But Thabiti, especially thinking about your maps, looking at the ways in which people moved, thinking about how the issue of mobility complicates an experience of enslavement. So I found myself looking at your maps and thinking, what does this mean for somebody's life? Is mobility, in their case, uprooting from communities and a lack of ability to form a community? Or is it maybe an opportunity, right? Could it be a positive experience to be moving to a new location and to get actually access to these British residents where they can appeal for emancipation and so on? So, all of the papers, I think, touched on this, but your maps really visually showed us mobility as well.
Yes. Another person? Yes, here.
I also very much appreciated all three papers and thought that they also suggest that the instability of labels. And it was interesting in the first two papers. In the first paper, we're supposed to take Zanzibar origins literally. And in the second paper, we know that Zanzibar, being labeled Zanzibari, is a construction. But in fact, both are true, right, for both papers. And so how we can think about that. And then I think the third paper really, I mean, especially for the setting that we are in now, and really destabilized some of the way that we think about these labels. And so, my comment only is that just the way that these things seem to work together across these papers, and the ways that we could all be maybe more cognizant of labels in the same way that Hideaki asked us to think deeper onto the label of Africans earlier today.
There's another one. There was an hand, yes, over there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm very much interested in, I think, Professor Breben, about the Zanzibaris in South Africa. Who labeled them? They regarded themselves as Zanzibaris, or someone else labeled them as Zanzibaris? And is it not connected with the wider definition of Zanzibar, not as Zanzibar island, but Swahili culture of Zenji Empire? And as another one, maybe comment or a question to Mr. Mustafa. You said that the Turks looked down upon the Arabs as traitors. They betrayed them because of the Arab revolt. But I understand the Persians also looked down upon the Arabs, though the Arabs conquered them. So how do you compare and contrast these? How do we comprehend this? Thank you.
Okay, any other question? Yes.
Wonderful papers. I have questions for all of you, but I'll just focus one to Mustafa. Could you say something about cosmopolitanism? Because in some ways I think it connects to what we've been talking about in the morning session about Zanzibar, but also certainly in contemporary Gulf states where cosmopolitanism is used, I think, in a similar way to what you're describing in the Ottoman historiography, right? That here is a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic empire that is so diverse, and it's, maintains this wide degree of peace. And so we can say something similar, right? Gulf states often use that image to explain color blindness, under a sort of a universalizing, sense of identity. And I think in Zanzibar too. Is there some similarity, do you think, to the contemporary deployment of that notion of cosmopolitanism to explain the relative absence in some of those places of conflict, as you have in the Ottoman historiography? I'm just curious. Thanks.
Any other question? Okay, so that's it.
Thank you so much for the George's presentations. My question to Mustafa Minawi. You told that in last time of the 19th century, racialized language increased. But when we think with the pan-Islamist movements, and even at the end of the 19th century, many people in Africa, even in India, send a question to the Fatwa Hane. They are asking question to the Fatwa Hane, the office of Sheikhul Islam, and we can see many questions coming from Africa and India. So, what is your last comment about the situation, constructing the race versus constructing pan-Islamists or Ummah opinion, idea? Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to give you time to reply. Maybe we should start with Thabiti. Okay. The mic.
Thank you all for your questions, for your comments. It's given me a lot to think about. Dodi, the point you raised about, the kind of contrasting of, what, or again, and I guess a question is implied within it even. What about the narratives of people's journeys, struggles, that are articulated at a moment in which a possibility of freedom, something tangible, is made available? Are we to take as literal, versus construction, right? And I guess I think about this also in relationship to your comment too, Emery, and to something I've been thinking about in terms of how thinking about performance might be helpful, right? In terms of ways that people are aware of that there are different kind of scripts or different kinds of there are expectations that their audience has of them, that if they represent themselves or make themselves legible in particular ways, that has a tangible result. And I think that can be a helpful way of making sense as well as grappling with the constructedness, right? Because sometimes, even again within the sources, sometimes there's a reference to Zanzibar, sometimes it's Zanzibar, and again, I just can't help but think that particular places are being invoked for a range of reasons that because of the question of mobility, that people are coming from vast distances at various time lengths in terms of some of these people are younger, right? Some of these people are 50, 60 years, right? How do we begin to think about the meaning of the particular places have at that moment and to the audience that they're speaking to? And again, I think it invites us to destabilize the need for the narrative to be about a kind of factual, evidence-based account that they're rendering, but about a way of narrating an experience where, again, just the fact that they're arriving in this volume to seek manumission suggests there's clearly an understanding about here's a place where you go to get a particular set of resources. Okay, there is some level of accountability in terms of that, the British agent is doing some work in helping to try to verify some aspects of the story, or what is more commonly agreed upon as. But again, I think it's messy, it's loose, it's inconsistent, it's incomplete, and decisions are being made based on incomplete knowledge. And I think that's something for us all to think more deeply about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for very good questions. I think mobility and flux is very important to go. I mean, Aung San Ho in the morning talked about peoples of the Indian Ocean world being pre-mixed previous to colonization also. So I think that's an important point, that we don't have a sort of pre-colonial or whatever point of departure in which you have authentic unified unities of peoples living next to each other. I mean, there's always been mixture and flux and movement, and that also goes for these peoples who become enslaved and then liberated and enter into these different processes of construction, identities, and responding to classifications and so on. I think as far as the Zanzibaris are concerned, I mean that was obviously a very simple sort of thing at the outset because they were advertised in Natal newspapers as liberated Africans from Zanzibar being, available. So farmers and employers could apply to have assigned a number of these liberated Africans for the paying of a cost of administration and so on. So they became referred to as Zanzibaris in that context. What we don't know so much about is then when exactly they start applying it as a self-identification until we get into the 20th century and people start to use it as a label to avoid being classified within segregationist legislation in South Africa as Africans. I mean, to avoid paying the poll tax, to avoid being, excluded from residence in non-African parts of cities and so on. So it clearly becomes a sort of instrumentalist construction to negotiate or to move around within this segregationist setting, and then eventually under apartheid, that becomes a very successful strategy because these Zanzibaris become comprised within a sort of special apartheid population grouping called other Asiatics, and that allows them access to Indian education, to Indian institutions, hospitals, and so on. So there's clearly an opportunistic element to it, and also to the change in constructing a Makua alternative identity after 1994, after the end of apartheid, when they very successfully managed to get the land from which they had been expelled in 1961 on the bluff where they had originally settled and moved to an Indian township called Chatsworth. They then get the land on the bluff restituted to them, and that big case is still underway, and people are now discussing and negotiating whether it would be preferable to have some sort of money paid rather than that actual land giving back, which is now in the middle of a white residential area, and where there's or not so white anymore, but where there's a tremendous resistance to this moving back. But I mean, but to make that restitution possible, then you have to select the people who are entitled to reparations and restitution, and the criteria for that becomes that you have to prove that you are a descendant of this original group of 508, I think, original liberated Africans, and the documentary proof for that is your free pass. So that's so paradoxically, the free pass you are given at the end of your indentured labor contract period becomes your sort of ticket of membership within this group of original settlers. So, but my point is really also that I think I wrote an article at one point called Zanzibaris or Amakwa, and I think we must accept these constructions as realities also. So in a sense, the long period in which these people lived as Zanzibaris and came to believe in that history in many ways is as real as anything else. So it would be more to the point to say Zanzibaris and Amakwa, and to accept both constructions as having validity and usefulness within different settings.
Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I took notes, but I hope I can read them. Probably one thing that can solve a lot of questions is that I'm a historian. What I mean by that is that many things could be true at the same time, and you always have to determine when, where, and for whom. All right, so I made clear that it's about Istanbulus living in Istanbul, interacting with other Istanbulus, elite, and during the late 19th, early 20th century, because they were living in a very specific context that allowed for those categories to take on different meanings and then have a different kind of capital, if you will, which is what I'm trying to say. So to say, for example, that pan-Islamism was happening at the same time is 100% true. So the policy of Abdul Hamid, very smart policy, worked in many ways, terrified the British and everybody else about this pan-Islamist, what Jamil Aydin called like the racialization of a Muslim in response to the racialization of a Catholic in Lebanon, or racialization of a Greek Orthodox as room, beyond the religion, was very much active, and in many ways it helped contribute to this kind of global idea that there is a caliph and an Islamic authority in Istanbul. That was very much true. That what I'm saying does not take away from it. What I'm trying to say is that only focusing on that leaves us blind to what else is happening. And what else is happening, we think happened because nationalism came about and suddenly we flipped a switch. It doesn't work that way. And the Ottomans were very much part of a larger imperial world at that time, where they're trying to redefine their place in the universe, particularly those that were very close to the center, where it mattered. It was existential, particularly when you were not Turkish identified or a Turkish speaker at home. So in the book I call them Arab Turks, Turkish Turks, really Arabic speakers, Turkish speakers, where the category of Arab or Turk start to get constructed during this very period with different connotations. So yes, everybody hates the Arabs. So Persians and Turks and you name it, Arabs are very easy to hate on. That's not what I'm implying. There is right now a very specific moment, if you're connected with politics in Istanbul and you love Turkey the way I do, you spend a lot of time there, you also are very aware of the very hardcore anti-Arab racialized rhetoric because of the elections that came about. But that didn't come out of nowhere just during the elections. This is very much tropes that were being drawn on for different reasons, some of which are explicitly racialized, even scientifically. It's a really kind of scary moment. It has a very specific history with Arabs, and it's an intimate history. It's a shared history. That's what distinguishes the relationship between Arabs and Persians versus Arabs and Turks. It's a very recent history that is not just forgotten but erased. That connection, the kind of the pulling apart of these people that were being redefined as the pulling apart was taking place was incredibly painful. For a lot of people, and we don't talk about it. The history of that is usually switched. Even the history of the Ottoman Empire sometimes is divided either by province or by nation state that inherited the Ottoman Empire. The argument that I'm making is about the intimacy, actually, of Arabic-speaking majority people and Turkish-speaking majority people in the metropole that claimed the empire together. That is, the Persian Empire was always outside of that. So that's where the distinction is, but you're absolutely right. I actually get a lot of comments about, why are you doing this? You know, people already hate Muslims and Arabs, and now you're adding racism. And I say, if I don't do it, who will? No, what I mean by that is that, look at the good, bad, and ugly, including the shared things that are good, bad, and ugly. It's important. It's necessary, actually, particularly in this moment, which is the afterlife of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, even though it sounds to people that are outside of the region, actually, people in the region, as something like, you might as well say, the Roman Empire, because it was purposely kind of excluded, divided. In Turkey, it's getting redefined because of this last 15 years and the administration that is ahead. And of course, it's reinventing itself. It's reinventing itself and excluding all of the good, bad. No, it's keeping the bad, it's keeping the good. It's excluding the bad and the ugly, right? So for instance, when I wrote the first book and it came out in Turkish, I was crucified because I'm talking about imperialism in Africa and associated imperialism in the Ottoman Empire. Now, I'm not concerned with the government's rhetoric. I'm concerned with the day-to-day people and their connection to their own ancestry, their own immediate history. Like less than 100, like we're talking 100 years ago. Literally, it was only 100 years ago now, 1923, when the final kind of ripping apart happened. And that in the former Arab provinces that became the Arab world is erased. Talking about these connections is very important. I know we're running out of time, but I'm trying to answer as many as I can, as quickly as I can. Cosmopolitanism, yes. Multiculturalism is always like, oh, but it was multicultural, right? Yes, of course it was multicultural. It was multilingual, but people usually deal with, okay, we'll give you millet, right? We'll give you Musliman versus Ayr Muslim, like Muslims versus non-Muslims and how they were treated. But we're not going to talk about ethnicity as if it's a real thing and it has real impact. It's different religions that lived happily together. Of course, they were stratified, always been stratified in different ways. It changes over time. But everybody know your place system is very similar to what's happening in the Gulf. Right? Like, yeah, we have, look at us, we're multicultural, but of course, you get paid based on your race. Let's be very real. So, and that rhetoric of multiculturalism in the Ottoman Empire, they were not addressing this global world, kind of globalized world, is not the same as what the Gulf states need to do now because, other than saying we're modern as well, by the way, they didn't need to prove anything except when it came to the non-Muslim minorities because the foreign states were interfering, causing a kind of collapse of the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire from inside. Now, ethnicities such as Arab and non-Arab does not get studied or doesn't be talked about because of exactly that. We've only focused on one.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it? I think that's it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you and the panelists as well. Okay, so that's the end.